I was setting foot on Georgia soil for the first time in 3 years. Those roads? Roads lined with tall pine trees, each one looking the same, but reminding me of the bitterness of my childhood. As familiar as the scenery filtering through the car window was, I had a foreign feeling inside. It was as if I was returning as a tourist to a country of my own past. After my mother's death, I had completely lost touch with the Whitmore family. In fact, apart from my mother, those ties had already loosened, but in her absence, they had completely unraveled. The last time I spoke to my father, he didn't hesitate to turn his back on me. "Life is about choices," he said, "and you chose the wrong one." I chose to study architecture, not law, to understand art, lines, and spaces. They were after the abstract triumphs that glorified their last name: lawsuits, awards, political donations. My name was just a footnote in that world. Yet today I was returning to Whitmore Hall, not of my own volition, but of a summons. A cold, one-sentence letter from my grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore. "You are required to be present at Whitmore Hall on Saturday at 3 p.m. for a matter relating to the family estate." There was no longing underneath, no compassion, just a cold signature, and a date that looked like an instruction. It wasn't my father who wanted me to be there, I'm sure of that. For him, I was already expendable. But my grandmother, I never quite understood what she was thinking. She was a woman who was respected without needing love, and I always knew there was a calculation behind her gaze. I slowed the car down on the stone road at the entrance to the mansion. The wooden fences, the seemingly endless fields I used to run away from as a child, everything was still there. Only I had changed, or so I hoped. The gate was open. That detail said it all. They were waiting for me. When I stepped into the house, the familiar smell in the air immediately hit me. Old books, polished wood, a little lavender. Time seemed to have forgotten to move inside this house. Same carpets, same heavy curtains, same heavy silence. "Claire." I turned around, my eyes softening briefly. Maria, the woman who had worked at home since I was a child. The lines on her face were a little deeper, but her smile was still the same. She came to me quietly, pressing her hands tightly against the edge of the apron she held. "I heard you were coming," she said. "It took courage, but you were always brave." I smiled. Maybe he was the only person in this house who had ever approached me unconditionally. I bowed my head. "Thank you, Maria. Where are they?" "In the drawing room. Miss Eleanor has gathered everyone." Then she added in a whisper, "She wants to see you." I took a deep breath, as if all the oxygen in my chest was trapped in a narrow hole. My feet felt heavy, but I walked. Memories poured over me as I walked down that corridor. The day I was scolded for slipping on the banister of the stairs, the sketchbook my mother secretly brought me, the moment my father gave me a biography of Thomas Jefferson as a birthday present and told me to be like that man. When I reached the door of the drawing room, my hand reached for the knob, but I stopped. I didn't know what was waiting for me inside, but I knew one thing. This place was still full of people ready to look down on me. I pushed the door slowly, and there they were. My father stood by the window in his gray suit, his back straight. My Uncle Raymond slumped in the armchair, a newspaper draped over his face. My cousin Evelyn, her knees crossed, one hand on her phone, the other on her coffee. But most striking was my grandmother Eleanor, as always, erect, calm, and watching. It was as if this was a chessboard and I was a pawn in front of her. "You're on time," she said. "On time," I said. "I guess punctuality is still important." A thin smile appeared on his face. Then the lawyer put the files on the table. "Claire," Eleanor said, "there's a special clause for you. It's in my will." The air in the room suddenly felt heavy. It was as if an unseen hand had pressed down on all of our shoulders. "You will receive a share of the estate," she continued, "but on one condition. he said, looking me straight in the eye. "You will restore this house, restore it to its former glory, and open it to the public." I froze. "You have 6 months. If you agree, the inheritance is yours. If you don't, it goes to other hands." Sometimes, being part of a family is not just about having a surname. It's about choosing which burden to carry willingly. Whitmore Hall. To an outsider, it might just be an impressive building, but to an insider, especially someone like me, it was not just a house of stone and brick. It was nothing more than the petrified embodiment of the Whitmore family's taciturn but stern rule, a tradition that had been passed down for generations. The high ceilings, the dimly lit corridors, the heavily framed portraits adorning the walls, each one reminded me again and again whose rules were to be lived by here. This house was like a museum of how power was quietly but sharply imposed. Every stone, every creak of wood, like a decision, irrevocable and unquestionable. My grandfather, Arthur Whitmore, was one of Georgia's most respected judges. His name is still mentioned in law schools, and some local courthouses were inaugurated with his name. But the only thing that sticks in my memory are the hallways that echoed with his authoritative voice, and the trembling sense of trepidation I felt every time I looked into his face. There were no smiles in this house. At most, there were nods and expressions of appreciation. Love was traded for success. Rules and traditions cast a gray shadow over each individual. That's why in the Whitmore family there was shame when someone made a mistake, not when someone cried. And me? I was too colorful a soul to fit into that shadow. Years ago, as a child in one of these halls, I was caught by my father drawing in an architectural sketchbook that my mother had secretly given me as a gift. He sternly took it away from me and told me, "It's one thing to dream, Claire, and another to be real. You are a Whitmore, and Whitmores don't waste time daydreaming." At that moment, something inside me cracked. It was as if a dream that belonged to me had been judged for the first time. And from that day on, I learned to take every step carefully in this house, but I never felt like I belonged. Today, years later, as I took those steps again, the coldness of the walls seemed to touch my skin. My footsteps echoed on the marble floor as if the house recognized me and whispered, "Are you here again, Claire? What has changed?" I headed to the west wing of the mansion, which was my escape as a child. I had built a small world for myself in the unused rooms of that wing. An old playroom, a secret staircase leading to the roof, the space behind the shelves in the corner of the basement. Each was an escape route. Maybe that's where I found myself the most in this house. Sometimes growing up in life is not just about getting older. Sometimes growing up is walking down the same corridor again after years and realizing that those steps no longer control you. And I felt the first spark of that realization that morning in a dark corner of the house when I looked at a curtain slightly parted by the wind. But this feeling of freedom did not last long, because when I entered the library, everything fell into place again. My grandfather's thousands of volumes of law books were still on the same shelves. His handwritten decisions were framed on the walls. This room still carried his voice. Behavior is inherited, Claire. Decision-making is about carrying the family name, not just being right. I could still hear that voice in my ears, and a strange mixture formed inside me. Anger, bitterness, and a strange respect. Perhaps some roots, no matter how poisonous, one cannot completely uproot. Suddenly I caught sight of a small table in the corner of the library. That was the desk where my mother worked. Nobody knew, but my mother used to read books and sometimes write there, secretly from my father. I opened the desk drawer and found an old notebook. It was covered in dust, but it still had my mother's perfume on its pages. I opened it. The line written on the first page gave me chills. "It is not the walls that make a house a home, but the breathing of those inside. And I have not been able to breathe in this house for years." This sentence showed me that I was not alone. My mother had also fought her own internal war in the shadow of this house. But she was silenced. Restoring this house was no longer just an architectural project. It was about confronting the past, breaking the chains, and completing the breath that was knotted in my mother's throat. For them, Whitmore Hall was a symbol of power. For me, it is now a site of resistance. In the Whitmore family, success was measured in diploma frames, named office doors, and articles in law journals. Everyone's path was clear: Harvard Law, Yale, Stanford, a partnership in at least one legal consulting firm, and then a political consultancy. The Whitmore name wasn't just an identity, it was a career plan. But I was different. I didn't study law. I studied architecture, and at an arts-based architecture school, a small school in Chicago, but with a creative spirit. When the word first spread in my family, my Uncle Raymond pushed his glasses down the bridge of his nose and looked at me like this. "So you're going to draw buildings? Isn't there a real profession?" I still remember the silence in the living room that day. Everyone said nothing, but the same sentence was written on their faces: waste. In their eyes, I was the bearer of an unfinished life, a project that deviated before reaching where it was supposed to be, a stain that could damage the officiality of their surname. But I felt for the first time that something was really right inside me. My desire to become an architect was not only about aesthetics, being able to transform people through spaces, to make sense of voids, to analyze emotions hidden behind a wall. For me, architecture was not only art, it was psychology, existence. But every plan I drew for my family lost its meaning because it was outside the order they had built. My pen seemed to belong to a story they didn't write. The loneliness I experienced in those years was silent, but its pain was deep. The postcard I sent home in my first year at the school, "I won with a scholarship," was never answered. When I didn't return home during vacations, no one asked why. They didn't come to my graduation. My achievements never made it into the family newsletters, because in their eyes, I was just Claire, someone who carried the last name but did not represent it. What broke me the most was my mother's silence. In her heart, I knew she understood. She, too, had given up her dreams in the shadow of this house. But she chose to silence her dreams and squeeze into the role of a lady fit for her family. Her gaze was always the same: longing and fear. She both envied my courage and feared what that courage would cost her. Years later, when I was standing on my own 2 feet in Chicago, when I put my first desk lamp in my small office, when I printed my own business cards, when I remembered the streets I walked for weeks to find clients, I just wanted to hear from my family. A small appreciation, a simple, "We were worried about you." But he didn't. The Whitmores knew how to ignore anyone out of their orbit. Someone like me would only create a hole in their order. It was easier for them to pretend I didn't exist than to see that hole. Then one day, I had a design exhibition in Chicago. I had developed a concept on architecture and the representation of women, a collective work by 4 young women architects showing how their work integrates with their social identities. It attracted a great deal of attention at the exhibition. A local architecture magazine even interviewed me. I put a copy of the interview in an envelope and mailed it home. It came back. "Recipient moved from address" was written on the envelope in big letters. But I knew. It was something they had said to me. "You are no longer on our map." And maybe something became clear to me after that moment. I was no longer going to strive for acceptance where I didn't belong. I was going to build my own. I wasn't going to walk over those who despised me, but I wasn't going to enter their field of vision either. That day I said to myself, "Claire, you are not the black sheep. You are just the only one who chooses your own color." And yet, here I was, in this house. I was back. And there were still the same shadows on every wall, the same judgments, the same silent criticisms. Now I had my architectural knowledge, a few completed projects, and my own victories of struggle in Chicago. I might still be incomplete in their eyes, but I knew it is the intention of the foundation that carries a building, not the columns. And I was going to transform this house from its foundations, not to tear down what I had built, but to make myself where I did not belong. As the sun seeped through the heavy curtains of the living room, the faces of everyone in the room looked like pale portraits. The silence was so heavy that even the walnut wood polish on the table made more noise. Mr. Holloway, my grandmother's lawyer, old but sharp-eyed, carefully opened the file in front of him. He put on his glasses, cleared his throat. No one was talking. Even their breathing was measured. For the Whitmore family, the will was not just a division of property, but an affirmation of status. Who was important was determined by what was left behind. As Mr. Holloway read the first sentence, the air in the room cooled a notch. Familiar names and numbers followed. A summer house for my Uncle Raymond, a jewelry collection for my cousin Evelyn, a collection of books and stocks for my father. Then, my name. Claire Elise Whitmore, Mr. Holloway said, making his voice especially clear. The will stipulates only one condition for Claire to receive a share of the estate. I looked up and the lawyer's gaze locked on mine. There was a neutral but effective weight in his eyes. She will complete the restoration of Whitmore Hall and turn it into a family museum. A cold silence suddenly fell over the room, the kind of silence that comes just before an explosion, and then laughter. The first came from Raymond, followed by Evelyn's high-pitched voice. My father didn't laugh, but he turned his head to the side and sighed. I even felt that much. "Are you serious?" Raymond said sarcastically. "Claire, the restoration? We're going to leave the fate of such a valuable building to the games of architects?" Evelyn rolled her eyes. "I mean, she's going to go out of her tiny office in Chicago and restore the family mansion? This has got to be a bad joke on my grandmother's part." Grandma Eleanor was still sitting quietly in her armchair. She didn't react at all. It was as if everything was going according to plan. She was just watching me with her hands clasped together. She didn't smile or frown. Her eyes seemed to say, "It's your turn." The lawyer continued. "Claire has been given 6 months for the restoration process. Once the project is completed, the entire property will be transferred into Claire's name. If the condition is not met, the property will pass to the second in line of succession, Evelyn Whitmore." Evelyn's eyes lit up. Raymond shook his head from side to side, still laughing. "I don't understand how such a ridiculous clause was allowed," Raymond said. "This house is a historic building. This kind of project requires state permission, municipal approval, budget, labor. Claire doesn't have that kind of infrastructure." I didn't speak. I just felt something stirring in my heart. A spark, because everyone was saying I couldn't do it. Again, as they had done for years. They belittled my every step, questioned my every decision, ignored my every achievement. But what I was presented with now was not just a legacy, it was an opportunity. An opportunity to tell the walls what I couldn't tell the family. This mansion could be a challenge, not a reminder. As I put every stone back in its place, I would rewrite the past. I turned my eyes to my grandmother, and in that moment, for the first time in years, I saw someone who really looked at me, with me. Eleanor Whitmore, strict, calculating, cold, but also strategic. In bequeathing me this position, she was perhaps teaching her family the greatest lesson of all. This family needs a different voice. From that moment on, no one spoke. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It became an intense questioning. I had already started calculations in my head. Project management, necessary permits, building inspections, budget planning. While my family expected me to be only an emotional burden, I was up and running a professional project. My father fidgeted slightly in his chair. "Claire, this is a very serious responsibility. Are you sure?" For the first time, he didn't tell me, "You can't do it." "If I'm serious," I said, "I guess we'll find out in 6 months." Evelyn frowned. "There's no way to restore this house in 6 months. I mean, not in the real world." I smiled. "My real world is a little different, Evelyn." And that day, in the parlor of the Whitmore mansion, I looked not at an undeserved inheritance, but at a battle to be won. At that moment, time slowed down. It was as if the walls of the living room breathed, the ceiling lamp blinked, the floor seemed to be pulled out from under my feet. Everyone's eyes were on me. Eleanor's gaze was steady, my father's calculating. Evelyn's was almost jubilant, as if she believed I had stepped into a trap. But I kept my eyes fixed on one spot, listening to a quiet determination rising up inside me, the same inner voice that guided me through the nights at university when I stayed up all night before the workshop was over, the same voice that kept me from giving up when my projects were rejected. I took a deep breath. "I accept," I said. The words hung in the air after they left my mouth. I waited. No applause, no smile, only a short silence. Then I realized that what appeared on the faces was not a smile. Slightly curled lips, raised eyebrows but hollow masks. They were smiling, yes, but those smiles were mockery, not triumph. "Look how he took the bait." Maybe not one of them said it, but they all thought it. I sensed it. Evelyn was the first to speak. "I admire your courage, Claire," she said, her voice sweet but sarcastic. "Jumping into such an ambitious project. Impressive." Then she glanced at me, a contrived look of surprise on her face. "So this is technically architecture, right?" For a moment, the anger inside me burned my head, but I breathed in. It wasn't worth provoking. "Yes," I said, "it's a matter of technique, aesthetics, and a little vision." My father leaned back in his chair. He placed his hands on the table. As always, he thought for a while before taking the floor, or gave the impression that he did. "Claire," he said slowly, "restoring this mansion will not be easy. It's not just a grand structure, it's a historical asset. One wrong move, architecturally and legally, could put everything at risk. Are you sure you are strong enough to take this burden?" There was contempt mixed with curiosity in that sentence. I didn't need to answer, but I did. "I've been running my own projects on my own for years. They may be small, but I've been in charge of them all. And this house, yes, it's big, but it's not a burden. It's an opportunity for me." Eleanor bowed her head slightly, a faint flicker in her eyes. Perhaps approval, perhaps something else. It was always hard to read that woman. When the meeting was over, everyone started to leave the room. Evelyn left without a backward glance. My Uncle Raymond had a long whisper with the lawyer. My father turned to me on his way out the door. "If you can't handle this," he said, "the inheritance can be reconsidered. It may be necessary to look beyond the will to the interests of the family." It was a so-called warning, a veiled threat, in fact. But I smiled, a real smile. "I never say yes to anything I can't handle, Dad." My heart was still pounding when I was alone in the hallway. I clenched and unclenched my hands, took a deep breath through my nose. My insides were a mess, but one thing was clear. This was not just a story of inheritance. This was the beginning of a new connection to my past. Whitmore Hall had been a shadow that had defined me over the years. Now I had a chance to shine my own light in that shadow. Maybe not to prove myself to them, but to say to myself, "Look, you can do it." In the evening that day, when I went up to the house, my temporary quarters in the mansion, I looked out the window and saw that the stone walkway in the garden was still cracked in places. Bushes leaning over the edges, dried roses. Every detail whispered of years of indifference. I thought to myself, if this house were a person, perhaps it would feel lonely, neglected, but still standing, just like me. That night, I opened an old sketchbook in my room. The first thing I drew on the page was neither wall nor window. I wrote one word, intention. Because every building process starts with an intention. The stones are laid after that. And my intention was now clear, not just to restore this house, but to transform the war between me and this house, maybe to a peace, maybe to a new identity. It was cool and quiet inside the mansion. Although it was daytime, the curtains were closed. The light was left outside as usual. Inside, time seemed to have stopped. The clocks did not hang, the wallpaper was faded but not removed, the armchairs were left as they were. It was as if even the house was waiting, or had given up. My footsteps echoed and the familiar creaks penetrated me. As a child, I used to run through these corridors, taking off my shoes and sliding on the carpets, each time being warned, "That's no way for a Whitmore to behave." Now, as I walked through the same corridors step by step, those echoes came back to me. But this time, no one was stopping me. Maybe they couldn't stop me now. I walked first to the room in the east wing, my old study, the refuge of my childhood. When I opened the door, a thin layer of dust from years of accumulation and the smell of dried lavender hit my face. The smell reminded me of the first notebook my mother gave me as a gift, a notebook that I tried to keep more than scribbling on its pages. The room was small but private. The only window had been opened years ago at my request. My father was against it at first. "The sun will fade the wallpaper," he said. But my mother insisted. The sun would not fade it. The light revealed the hidden shadows. My desk was still there. The top cracked but intact. I slowly pulled out the drawer and found a broken pencil, some yellowed paper, and a small drawing tucked away. An imaginary house plan I drew when I was 12. The walls are made of glass. The roof is green. Even at that age, I dreamed of a living space in touch with nature. I didn't want to escape the city, but to build a world in harmony with it. But that drawing was deemed too romantic by my father. "It's good to dream," he said at the time, "but we build reality." But there was something nobody understood. For them, projects were measured by money, name, status. For me, architecture started with feeling. How would people feel inside that house? Where should the light hit? Should a child's room wake up to the morning sun or face a quiet north wall? I was considered a misfit for asking these questions. As I looked around that little room, I realized something. They had never listened to me in this house, but this room had listened to me. Everything was still in its place. The water stain in the attic was still in the corner. The books on the shelves were in order. The passing years had left only dust. They had not erased the traces. I looked out the window. The cypress tree in the garden was still standing. I thought of my cat, Lily, buried next to it. When I lost her, it was the first time I had ever experienced real loss. And that day, I learned not to hide my feelings. I cried, and I cried loudly. Eleanor said to me that day as she handed me a handkerchief, "A Whitmore can cry, Claire, but only when the doors are closed." What that sentence really told me was this message. You can have feelings, but no one should see them. That day, in the shadow of that house, I started to build my own walls. But now it was time to tear down those walls. As I walked around the house, I realized that this structure was not only physically broken, but emotionally as well. The ceiling decorations had fallen off. Some of the archways were cracked. Most of the bedrooms were locked. The stair railings were loose from years of neglect. But it was the state of the kitchen that broke my heart the most. The space where Maria used to work, where my mother secretly made jam, was now empty. The countertops were cracked and the sink rusted, but the window still let in the morning light from just the right angle. I envisioned a scene of my mother standing there, brewing tea, the day he looked at me through his glasses and said, "I think you should be an architect." That day, when I bowed my head with a silent smile and wondered if I would dare one day. And now here I was, I had already made that decision, without their approval. Sometimes the strongest echo of the past is hidden in the memories that no one speaks of, and sometimes the greatest battle is to silence that silence. This house had taught me to be silent, but now it was calling out to me to tell me with each of its cracks. Perhaps the fate of this house had intersected with mine. It too had been silenced for years, its voice suppressed, its history buried in stone. And now we were both getting ready to stand up. Dusty, but standing. Alone, but determined. For me, restoration was not only an architectural process, it was also a way of building my identity and my rightful place in front of my family. And I started this journey in the way I was used to, with a plan. During the first week, I drew until the wee hours of the morning, studying old plans, digitizing ceiling proportions, arch structures, load-bearing wall drawings. I created separate files for every detail, from the landscaping of the garden to the internal circulation of the kitchen. I thought of turning the ground floor into an open exhibition space, redesigning the great hall with a flexible use plan for events. I wanted to turn the upper floors into a museum of family history, and the attic into a permanent architectural archive. I realized that this building was not only made of stone, wood, and glass, it was made of repressed memories, repressed women, repressed dreams. And I was determined to repair all the cracks in that structure, both technically and symbolically. But no matter how solid the plan was, the battle was not just about the project. One morning, as I was working in the entrance hall of the mansion with the files, Mr. Holloway came up to me. There was a slight tension in his usually serious, almost emotionless face. He glanced around before setting the coffee down on my desk, then leaned in close. "Claire," he said, "it may not be right to tell you this officially, but you need to know." I looked up, feeling a strange emptiness inside me. They don't want to make this process easier. On the contrary, they will do everything they can to intimidate you. I frowned. Who? Raymond, Evelyn, and although it's not explicitly stated, your father doesn't want this to go smoothly either. I was silent, something lodged in my throat. If you succeed, Holloway continued, it will change not only the inheritance, but the dynamics within the family. Evelyn has been raised for years as the heir to the Whitmore name. Now you're quietly stepping up and taking over the estate. To them, it's an injustice. It's a project, I said, a mission, the clause of a will. No, Holloway said. You may see it that way, but for them, this is power sharing. It's a battle for control, Claire. It's not about inheritance. It's about you trying to prove that you belong. It was the first time I realized he was really warning me. This wasn't just a battle to be won on the drawing board. There would be bureaucracy, sabotage, innuendo, even outright obstruction. And he was right. In the early days, I already started to see traces of these. The applications I submitted to the municipality were delayed. My file was claimed to be incomplete, even though I had meticulously prepared every piece of paperwork. When the clerk in the city planning office, a former classmate of Evelyn's, smiled at me and said, "We'll have to wait a while," I knew exactly what he meant. Later, I met with the stonemasons who were going to start working around the mansion. Some of them withdrew from the project at the last minute, without giving a reason. When I found out they were connected to Raymond's construction company, the picture became clearer. My family wasn't attacking me directly, but they were blocking roads and moving stones secretly. Not to disappoint me, but to discourage me. But there was something they didn't know. My greatest strength was resistance. It was the same when I was a child. When they scolded me not to talk, I started writing in my notebook, and when they found it in my mother's closet, they burned it. I didn't stop writing. I drew on the walls, and they silenced me again. Finally, they turned off all the lights in my room. But I had learned to dream in the dark. I was used to fighting against obstacles. I knew their silent language of war. I knew how to stand up when they smiled in my face and tripped me from behind. One night, after examining the stone wall of the kitchen, I went out into the garden. The sky was clear, the stars silent. The smell of the earth filled my nose. I reached into my pocket and took out a small piece of paper from my notebook. I wrote it down. Buildings survive not by endurance, but by persistence. It was my own sentence, and that was what would sustain me throughout this project. I was no longer just an architect. I was going to be the silent voice of this house. The stairs leading to the mansion's attic were almost sullen from years of disuse. The creak of each step reminded me of the whispers of the house. In the Whitmore family, this was known as the junk area, and hardly anyone ever visited. But I remembered sneaking up here as a child and daydreaming in silence, drawing my own drawings on the walls in dark corners, without telling anyone, without anyone hearing. Now I was there again, but this time I was looking for something else, maybe answers, maybe voices silenced by the past, maybe just a trace. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but something seemed to call me up. There was a heavy silence in the attic, dominated by dust, cobwebs, and the smell of musty books. A few old suitcases, broken chairs, torn curtains. Everything seemed borrowed from time. I moved slowly with my flashlight, and my eye fell on a worn, leather-covered box in the corner. I shuddered when I saw the letters E.W. engraved on it. Eleanor Whitmore. My heart skipped a beat as I opened the box. The lid creaked open, and out came a notebook filled with my grandmother's familiar handwriting that I hadn't seen in years. The cover was faded, the corners frayed, but it still looked dignified, just like its owner. I turned slowly to the first page, written in blue ink in round, patient letters. Eleanor Whitmore, 1949. This notebook is the place for everything I keep for myself. At first, there were meaningless notes, books she had read, sentences she liked, some court notes. But after a few pages, the writing began to change. The sentences became more personal, more fragile. Inside this house, women always spoke in whispers, always in shadow. But one day, I will build my own library, a space of knowledge belonging to women, run by women. Even if my family doesn't approve, something inside me says I belong in it. The next page reads, I dream of a legal archive, a place where not only the decisions of men but also the experiences of women can be documented, shelves where true stories can be told. That's when I realized Eleanor wasn't just tough. She too had repressed dreams. She too was restricted, silenced, but differently, she wrote them down, hoping that one day someone would read them. Maybe he left an echo in this box, this notebook, which he thought would never be opened. And that echo reached me. Towards the end of the notebook, there was this sentence, I will not be given this opportunity. I know, but one day another woman will breathe in this house, and maybe she will achieve what I could not. The walls of this house will change with her. My eyes welled up. Eleanor had been distant from me for years, always in control. But now, with those words, for the first time, I felt that she was really close to me. Everything she had failed to achieve in her own life was now at my fingertips. I pressed the notebook to my chest as if something inside me had come together. This restoration project was no longer just my story. It was giving voice to Eleanor's silence. It was to complete the legacy of a woman who left her dream unfinished. The idea of establishing a women's archive inside the mansion. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Legacies were not only money, property, or surnames, sometimes they were unfinished sentences. And it became my duty to finish these sentences, because I wasn't just going to put this house back on its feet. I was going to unearth the dream Eleanor had quietly buried. When I came downstairs, I walked into the living room, notebook in hand, spread my plans out on the table, and started a new title, Whitmore Women's Archive. I made a note under it. The east wing would be the library area. The exhibition room could be Eleanor's old room. The notebook in the attic would be the first exhibit. In that moment, for the first time in this house, I felt powerful, not as a Whitmore, but as a woman, as a bearer of dreams. When someone leaves me a dream, it's a sacred responsibility to fulfill it. Lucas was always the right boy, the one who spoke at family gatherings, the one who was praised when his teachers called, the one whose achievement awards were displayed in the cabinet in the center of the living room. His photos were always in the frame. Mine were usually in the drawer. He was 3 years older than me. But we didn't grow up like peers. He learned to look up very early. And I stopped telling from below too early. His law school at Columbia University was like a sacred fulfillment for the Whitmore family. He walked in my grandfather's footsteps with my father's pride. The framing of his diplomas on the walls coincided with the erasure of my drawings from the walls. And now, he was a partner in one of the biggest consulting firms in the country. There he was, with his office on the 37th floor of a skyscraper in New York City, his staff below him, and his triumphant suits. I, on the other hand, was trying to repair the roof of a stone mansion in Georgia. In short, Lucas was the success his parents had planned. I was the aberration they hadn't foreseen. When I came face to face with him, I was in the 3rd week of the restoration project. I had had the house's weathered walls cleaned, the interior analyzed, and I had decided to restore the original column plan of the architectural structure that had been altered in the 1960s. My hands were covered in lime dust, my hair in plaster particles. That day, he said he had come for a meeting, a gray suit, a silver watch, a pungent perfume. When he stepped into the hall, it was as if the whole place belonged to him, not the room, but the atmosphere. "Claire," he said, "even this much is too ironic." I raised my eyebrows. "What's ironic?" "That you think you can carry the Whitmore name by painting walls," he said. His voice was icy cold, sarcastic and cutting. Anger wasn't the first thing that went through me. It was fatigue. For years, we'd been talking in the same tone, with the same distance, as if I wasn't his little brother, but an intern who would never graduate, as if my accomplishments were hobbies and his were real. "I'm not painting walls, Lucas," I said. "I'm rebuilding a legacy." He shook his head. "It's just an emotional move on my grandmother's part, an attempt to make up for her disappointment. But what do you still think you're adding to the family? You don't restore a legacy by laying bricks. Our family name is not measured in stone alone." I took a deep breath. "For you, our last name is just the pomp and circumstance on a sign, isn't it? The line on the CV, a tag on LinkedIn to look impressive. But for me, this house, this past unfinished stories that need to be remembered." "You're the loose end," he said. "You took a wrong turn at the beginning of your life. Now you want to go back down that street, but this house is not a signpost." There was a moment of silence. His words were heavy, because there was not only contempt, but also pent-up anger. Then I added slowly, "Lucas, you never once said, 'How are you?' to your little brother. You asked me what I was reading, what I love. You just thought that because I was off the map, I should be wiped off the map." His gaze faltered briefly. Then immediately that familiar wall returned to his eyes. "I did right by our family name," he said, "and you shamed us." Nothing inside me broke, because that piece had already cracked. This was just the last crumb. Lucas has always measured people by success, grades, titles, earnings. My measure was emotion, what you make me feel, what you leave me with. Maybe that's why every conversation with him felt like we grew up in the same house, but were born in different countries. And that's when I realized Lucas was not my enemy, but he had never seen me. Since I was little, I was just a missing figure in his eyes. And sometimes the greatest betrayal comes not from those you don't love, but from those you've never seen. As he was leaving, he turned to me and said, "If in 6 months this house is still standing, maybe we can sit down and talk." 6 months from now, I said. This house won't just be standing, It will be breathing. And you will hear that breath for the first time. I closed the door behind him. Not my brother, but his shadow still lingered in the hallway. I was no longer afraid of shadows. When the restoration process started, I was alone. I made the first drawing alone, the first stone analysis, the first measuring line, the first support column plan. I was carrying the heavy history of the Whitmore mansion on my back while struggling with my own past. But then, one day, someone came. It was the second week of construction. Early in the morning, I was out in the garden looking at the cracked stones, drawing files in hand, hundreds of questions in my head. Then I heard a familiar voice behind me. If those stones are still there, my father placed them. They are intact. But if they have moved, either the wall has collapsed or the heart has broken. I turned. There was an old man, his hat in his hand, his back hunched, but his eyes sparkling. "My name is Harold," he said. "Years ago, I was the stonemason of this mansion, working under Mr. Whitmore, but in Miss Eleanor's shadow. Now I would like to work with you. Would you let me?" I was surprised. My heart stopped for a moment, then began to beat rapidly. "Of course," I said. "I really need your help." Harold's arrival was a spark. Then others came. Joe, the old carpenter from town, Amelia the painter, Maria, the cleaning lady who had worked for my mother years ago, showed up with a rusty teapot. "My hands are still good," she said, "but your mother once gave me an honor to hold on to. Now it is my turn." And so the journey I had started alone turned into a crowded march. Not only the sounds of hammers echoed off the stone walls of the mansion, but also the whispers of solidarity, the restorative whispers of the past. At first some hesitated. There were those who averted their eyes when they heard the name Whitmore, who were afraid to even touch the walls of the house, because this house was not just a building, but a symbol of fear for them, the shadow of a surname looking down from above. Whitmore was the name of silent punishments, invisible borders. But over time, as they worked with me, as they saw the plans, as they went inside, they were introduced to another form of that surname. Because I didn't give orders, I listened. I consulted, not indicated. I repaired, not fixed. And the townspeople understood the language. Harold said to me one day, "Claire, for years we bowed down to the Whitmore name, but now you're holding it in our hands. For the first time, this surname is becoming a story in which we are part of." That word was engraved on my heart. As the restoration progressed, not only the structure of the building was being rebuilt, but also a social memory. Maria remembered my mother's recipes in the kitchen. Joe told me about my grandmother's secret book orders, books by women authors that were not even allowed to be sold in town. Inside this house, there were invisible women, unspoken workers, silent contributions, forgotten labor. We were now putting it all on the walls, in the design, in the writing. There was a testimony in every layer, and I realized this restoration was no longer just an architectural act. It was a rebellion. Sometimes silent, sometimes echoing with the sound of a hammer. But most of all, it was built with unity. The town started talking about this change. Little cards saying, "We work for Claire," appeared in the windows of old shopkeepers' shops. In the bakery, blueprints for the Whitmore mansion were posted on the wall. The new museum, a story from us. It didn't take long for my family to recognize this support. Evelyn scoffed at first. "Are you turning the mansion into a small-town theater?" Raymond was offended. My father sent a formal letter of warning to the mayor, concerns about the safety of the project. But no matter what they did, there was no turning back, because this struggle was not just mine. It was now the voice of a collective memory, of a labor that had been ignored, of a people who had been silenced. The surname Whitmore, for the first time, gave me hope, not fear. One evening, sitting on the porch after work, Harold said to me, You're not restoring this house, Claire. You are rewriting a legacy with justice. This is your rebellion, and we are proud to walk beside you." My eyes welled up. It was the first time I really felt like I belonged in this house. For the first time, someone had accepted me not as Claire Whitmore, but just as Claire. As I sipped my morning coffee, Harold and I were discussing plans for the building site. We were exchanging ideas for the flooring in the new library room when Maria rushed in. She was holding a folded newspaper. Her face was tense. Her eyes hurried to me. "Claire," she said, "have you seen today's local edition?" I nodded, and he handed me the paper. The headline was in bold letters, "Whitmore Mansion, a therapeutic way back to family?" Underneath was a smaller but far more poisonous headline, "He stopped being an architect, now talks to walls." At first I couldn't feel anything. My eyes skimmed over the lines. I felt not only the weight of the words, but also the intention behind them. Throughout the article, my competence was questioned, my professional background was belittled, and it was even implied that I was experiencing a psychological crisis. My commitment to the project was presented as a trauma. It was as if I was not a professional fulfilling my grandmother's will, but someone stuck in childhood memories. The sentence that burned me the most was this: "We don't know what Claire Whitmore is trying to prove with this project, but maybe she just wants to be noticed by her family." The name at the bottom of the article, Caroline Whitmore, my cousin. The cousin who hid my dolls when I was little had my name removed from the end-of-year show in high school and then went to Harvard and single-handedly took all the family credit. Now he had the microphone in his hand and the media backing to sabotage me. That article was not just a criticism, it was the opening act of a systematic smear campaign. The next day, polite versions of the same news started circulating on social media. Can art and law merge? The story of a Whitmore, from trauma to design. People were commenting. Some people were mocking. I think they find drawings on Pinterest and make museums. Others were curious but skeptical. Is she really an architect? But the most painful thing was this: my project was not being talked about. It was me, my shortcomings, my past, my choices. That day I retreated to my room. I sat on my knees on the floor. My drawing papers were scattered on my desk, and I must confess, for a few minutes I asked myself, is Caroline right? Was I really just trying to improve my own story? Was this project just a return for me? Or was I still a joke in the eyes of others? But then I looked out the window. In the garden, Harold was placing the stones. Joe was measuring window frames. Maria was teaching a young girl how to hold a mop. And that's when I realized, this is not just my therapy. This is our construction, from our ashes. In the evening of the same day, I sent a statement to the newspaper where Caroline had been interviewed, but it wasn't a correction, as you might expect. I wrote, "I'm Claire Whitmore. I studied architecture in Chicago. I have worked on independent projects for over 10 years. I am currently restoring the Whitmore Mansion. This project is not only about restoring a historic building, but also about restoring invisible labor, forgotten women's stories, and repressed feelings of belonging. If anyone wants to call it therapy, yes, it is therapy, but not just for me, for this town, for this country, for all of us." And then I folded it up and put it in my notebook, because some things are not worth discussing, even if they can be answered. Some attacks can only be defeated by silence. But in my heart, I said to Caroline, "No, Caroline, this is not my therapy. This is my construction, from my ashes." That night, the lights in the mansion came back on for the first time in years. The plaster had been repaired. The cracks in the walls had been erased, but their traces were preserved, just like memories, not erased, but reshaped, repaired, reclaimed. The dim yellow light that spread to the garden had turned the house into a structure that was once inviting, not feared. The only thing I hung on the front of the mansion was a simple plaque, Whitmore Memory House. Underneath a small sentence, silenced voices now have an echo. I didn't send invitations, I didn't call the press, I didn't give my family any special notice, because this was no longer a place they controlled, but a place of memory that belonged to everyone. But they came anyway. Of course they came. Evelyn was the first to arrive. She entered the hall with cautious steps. Even her footsteps were hesitant. Then Caroline and Raymond. They began to walk around, hiding behind each other. Lucas came last. He wore a black jacket, formal but casual, as if to say, "I'm still on top of this." My father entered quietly. He walked around, careful not to make eye contact, but analyzing every corner. None of them spoke. I didn't speak to them either, because that night was not a time for words, but for demonstrations. From the entrance hall of the mansion, visitors were greeted by a different exhibition, a special section called The Contribution of the Whitmore Women. On the first wall was a photograph of my grandmother Eleanor when she was young. Underneath, in her own handwriting, was this line, "The strongest walls in this house are built by women who cannot speak." Next to it were her lawyer's documents, excerpts from her notebook, essays she had written throughout her life but never published. Each one was displayed in a glass box, respectfully and proudly. In the next room were my mother's old kitchen recipes, her own spice notes, tablecloths she had sewn with her own hands, a storyboard rewritten with Maria's stories. In this kitchen, not only food was cooked, but freedom, it read. Then the digital restoration of my great-aunt Ruth's 1943 essay, which was torn up by the family for being too feminine. Underneath, I wrote this sentence, "Silenced words do not rot away. One day someone will rebuild them." My parents were silent as they walked around those rooms. Caroline studied my grandmother Eleanor's notebook for a long time. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Lucas kept his head down in my mother's kitchen. Evelyn paused at this sentence hanging on the wall. "When your family can't hear you, you make your house talk." And my father, he didn't stay long in any of the rooms, but he stood one step at a time on each board. For the first time, there was an expression on his face that I could not read. No anger, no pride, no denial, just silence. And this time, that silence was not devastating, but thought-provoking. At the end of the night, I made a short speech in the hall, my voice not shaking, because this time, for the first time, I was not alone. This house, I said, was a symbol of an era, with its high walls, its strict rules, its quiet corridors, but now this building is no longer just stones. Now it stands with the echo of untold stories. My eyes fell on Caroline. It's not just my story, it's the story of my grandmother, my mother, the women of this town. And then I said the last sentence, looking around the room. This house is no longer just a Whitmore house. This house is now all of ours. There was no applause at that moment. No one cheered, but the silence that echoed in the room was the most powerful affirmation I had ever heard. For the first time, I saw reflection, not denial, in my family's eyes. For the first time, the name Whitmore became a reflection, not an armor. And for the first time, I was in the middle of my own story, not with any title, not with any label, only with the voice I deserve. The day after the opening night, I was home alone. The lights were off now. The footsteps of the visitors had receded and the walls were silent again. But this time, the silence was not eerie. This time, the silence was like the period at the end of a completed sentence. Deep, simple, meaningful. I was sitting in the living room, in one of the old armchairs, my sketchbook on my lap. But I wasn't drawing. I was just looking at the ceiling decorations, the broken crystal of the lamp, the portrait of my grandmother hanging in the corner. And then I heard a voice behind me. "Claire." I didn't get up. I didn't turn around. I just answered, "Lucas." I heard his footsteps, slow, measured but determined. He came to me. He stood in front of me on the couch. He had his hands in his pockets, but his eyes were unsteady. Not that look I'd seen so many times before. Not condescending, not patronizing. This time it was just a brother who was curious. "Did you really do this?" he asked. His voice was almost a whisper, but it was more real than I had heard in years. I looked up. I looked into his eyes. For the first time, I didn't run away. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain. I just said, "Yes, I did it." Then I paused for a few seconds, knowing the value of that pause. And I added, "Without you." Lucas's eyes were fixed for a moment. 1,000 words seemed to be running through him, but none of them came out. In his place, maybe someone else would have said, "Congratulations," or he would have been mature enough to say, "I was wrong." But Lucas wasn't like that, and I was no longer the kind of person to expect such words. What he didn't say was enough for me, because for the first time his eyes were really looking at me, not as a Whitmore, not as a little brother, not at all as a competitor. Just as Claire. A look that for years had tried to make me bow. That day, for the first time, she bowed her head. Not with pride, not in defeat, just in acceptance, just a bow as if to say, "You're in." And that's when I realized. It's not what people say, sometimes what they can't say is much more powerful. Lucas stood still for a few more seconds. Then he lowered his head and walked to the corner of the living room without averting his eyes. He stopped in front of the display case with my grandmother's notebook. He didn't read the pages, but he looked at it for a long time. And then, without saying goodbye to me, he left the house. But as he left, a burden that had been sitting on me like a stone for years seemed to lift with him. I thought I had always walked in his shadow, but then I realized he was actually blinded by his own light. And now, for the first time, he was looking at my light without blinking. Maybe he would never openly appreciate me. Maybe he would never say, "I was wrong." But that look, that silent acceptance, it was exactly what I had been waiting for all these years. That day I wrote this note in my notebook. If one day someone who has always looked down on you looks at you on an equal level for the first time, don't miss that eye contact, because some confrontations are experienced not in words, but in silence. My victory is not in shouting. This was completed with a silent yes. The next morning, the house was filled with a completely different shade of silence. There were no more construction noises, no echo of hammers, no clanking of stones, no breathing behind dust masks. Everything had given way. The walls of the mansion were silent for the first time. It was as if they had told all their stories and finally found peace. I, as usual, took my morning coffee and sat on the wide stone steps in front of the entrance hall. The air was cool, but not cold enough to chill my skin. I was warm inside. At that moment, a familiar car quietly entered the courtyard. A black, simple, but flashy car. The door opened and a man in a suit came out carrying his briefcase in both hands. Mr. Holloway. He smiled. He approached me. He bowed his head, holding his file in his hand, slightly raised. "If I may," he said in his usual polite but professional tone. I nodded. "Here you are." We went inside together. He sat at the desk in the entrance hall, now adorned with a museum plaque. He opened the documents. He spread the pages in front of me. "Claire Whitmore," she said. "As you know, the stipulation in Eleanor Whitmore's will has been officially fulfilled. The restoration of the mansion has been completed, and it has been opened for community use, approved by the municipality and family representatives. Therefore," he stopped. He smiled slightly. "The inheritance is now yours. The articles are complete." At that moment, I looked at the document in front of him, a white, clean page, clear sentences, clauses, sealed signatures. That sentence that I thought I deserved, that I had fought for, faced, endured for years was there in its clearest form. But strangely, there was no enthusiasm in me. I mean, I was happy, of course, but this happiness was not an outburst of triumph, but an inward peace, because I had already received this inheritance, not with a document, not with words, not by resistance. Mr. Holloway held out the pen. "Just sign it," he said. I didn't immediately reach for the pen. I looked at the page on the table for a while. Then I raised my eyes and I said, "I did not build this house with stone, but with people." "I understand," he said quietly. "This place no longer belongs to me. It belongs to us, to Eleanor, to my mother, to Maria, to Harold, to everyone who sweated here, whose voice was drowned out, whose photo was not framed." I took the pen. I signed the document. But I had this thought. I've already signed my name on these walls. As Mr. Holloway was putting the documents in his briefcase, he turned to me and said, "Eleanor left you not a name, but a blank space. It is up to you to choose how to fill it. And you did it, not with a name, but with a meaning." For the first time, I saw respect in her eyes, not bureaucratic respect, but human respect. That day, no property, no title, no document defined me, because now I had the power to make my own definition. I had the mansion, yes, but much more importantly, I had reclaimed myself. In the following days, the documents were formalized, but I had more than the documents, more than the seal, more than the engineering calculations. Townspeople continued to come and visit the mansion. Students, women, former workers. Each of them found a trace of themselves in those exhibition rooms. Each of them looked not at those stone walls, but at their own reflections. And one day Maria came and said, "Claire, we thought we gave you that mansion, but you gave us that mansion." That day I wrote in my notebook, "The real inheritance is not what is received, but what is transformed." If one day, instead of rejoicing when something is given to you, you realize that you have already built it, then you have truly won. Today there is a simple metal signboard just to the left of the entrance door of the mansion. It is not flashy, it is not shiny, it doesn't scream, but it is strong. Just like everyone who walks in, Claire Whitmore Architecture Studio. In smaller letters underneath, "When places change, people change." The day I placed that sign there, my hand did not tremble, because this time I was not following someone's footsteps, but marking my own path. Since the restoration was completed, the mansion is not just a museum, it is also a living studio. The old servants' quarters have been converted into workshops. The library is quiet but productive. University students come and do projects here. Young women from the town learn drawing here. And now I am passing on my much underestimated architectural background, that unfinished girl who used to only draw walls, an example that others now have the courage to build upon. My story, which started in the shadow of the past, is now becoming a source of light for others, because this studio represents not only my name, but all those who have made their own destiny. Lucas came back one day. He stopped when he saw the sign. He didn't go through the door, but he looked at it for a long time. He didn't say anything, and I didn't need to. Because sometimes there is something higher than words, the silent power of the work done. He doesn't shout at it, but it is heard. It is not pressed upon, but it cannot be erased. Some of my family are still silent, some are still distant, but that no longer makes me feel incomplete. Because I am no longer a surname, but a meaning. Eleanor's notebook in the window, my mother's recipes on the shelves, Maria's hands on the windows of the workshop. We're always together in this house. And for the first time, I am working without being alone. But most importantly, for the first time, I am living on my own. The other day, a high school student came by. He approached hesitantly. "Is this building really yours?" he asked. I smiled. "No," I said. "This building belongs to all of us, but this name, yes, it's mine now." That day, I wrote this sentence in my notebook. Nailing a sign with your own name on the wall is not just an achievement, it's a statement of existence. A person who paints his own wall owes no one, because that person lives in his own design, not in the world built by others. And now, as I write this story, I know this. This is not the restoration of a house. This is a woman's return from a place where she thought she didn't belong for years, is the story of building its own place.